The hearing will please come to order. Our first witness this morning is the Honorable Elliott Abrams, Assistant Secretary of State. Mr. Abrams, will you still rise? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated. Mr. Abrams, I've been advised that you have a statement you'd like to make at this juncture.
I would, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Will you put that mic closer to you, sir?
It is now 12 years since I came to Washington to work in this very building for the Congress of the United States. I arrived here in March of 1975 and worked first for a congressional committee, then on the personal staff of the late Senator Henry M. Jackson, and subsequently on the staff of Senator Daniel P. Moynihan. Senator Jackson was well known to many of the members of these committees. As you know, he believed in two cardinal principles with respect to foreign policy. He believed in the principle of bipartisanship, and he believed that Congress must be a powerful participant in the making of foreign policy. He practiced what he preached, and those were the lessons he taught those of us lucky enough to have the opportunity to work for him. I became an Assistant Secretary of State in 1981, and since July of 1985, I have served as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. This hearing today constitutes roughly my 60th appearance to give testimony before Congress on Latin American and Caribbean affairs in this short period. As always, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to answer questions about my stewardship of the Office of Assistant Secretary. Since July of 1985, the Bureau of Inter-American Affairs has continued to deal with our government's relations with the 30 countries of Central and South America and the Caribbean. They include such matters as the end of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, the transition to democracy in a number of Latin military dictatorships, the Latin debt problem, the promotion of democracy and human rights in Chile and Paraguay, our complex relations with Mexico, repression and subversion in Cuba, and of special interest in these hearings, the very grave problem of democracy and security in Central America. U.S. policy with respect to Nicaragua was set out by the Congress very shortly after I arrived in my current position in the International Development and Security Act of 1985, passed in August 1985. In that legislation, the Congress noted that the Nicaraguan communists had, quote, flagrantly violated the rights of the Nicaraguan people and the security of the nations in the region, had, quote, taken significant steps toward establishing a totalitarian communist dictatorship, had, quote, committed atrocities against its citizens, had, quote, aligned itself with the Soviet Union and Soviet allies, and had, quote, committed and refuses to cease aggression in the form of armed subversion against its neighbors. With supportive words for the united Nicaraguan opposition and the need for democracy in Nicaragua, and noting the special responsibility of the United States, Congress condemned the government of Nicaragua, called for a national dialogue there, and noted its support for efforts by the Nicaraguan democratic resistance to resolve the Nicaraguan conflict peacefully. Congress then approved $27 million for humanitarian assistance to the Nicaraguan democratic resistance. In distributing that assistance, in seeking the $100 million in additional and less restricted assistance finally approved by Congress in October 1986, and in implementing U.S. policy in the region, I have at all times, as my commission from the President instructs, executed and fulfilled the duties of my office according to law. As an advisor to the Secretary of State, as a spokesman for U.S. policy, as someone who works with the Congress literally every day, and as an official responsible for U.S. diplomacy in the region, I have tried to keep not only the letter, but the spirit of the law in mind. In all of my activities, I have been assisted by the extraordinary dedication and competence of the U.S. Foreign Service, and it has been my practice to work with and through Foreign Service officers and in the appropriate official channels rather than acting alone. U.S. policy and U.S. law have changed over the last 2 years, but certain fundamentals have remained constant. Support for peace and democracy in Central America and opposition to the consolidation of a communist regime in Nicaragua. These are views which the executive and legislative branches share. As an official of the Department of State, I have tried to promote those views and advance our country's interests with all the energy I can muster. The disclosures of November 25th and since have been surprising and sobering to me, and I have followed closely the accounts, some accurate, some inaccurate, of my own activities. It is important to me to set the record straight, and I look forward to discussing with you now the conduct of U.S. policy in the region and my role in it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you very much, sir. Mr. Mark Belnick will initiate the questioning.
Good morning, Mr. Abrams. By way of summarizing your background, you received an undergraduate degree from Harvard, did your master's work at the London School of Economics, and then received a law degree at Harvard Law School.
Correct.
You've served, as your opening statement indicated, on the staff of the late Senator Henry Jackson. You've served also on the staff of Senator Moynihan. You became an Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs in January of 1981, served in that capacity until the end of the year, when you became Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. And you served in that capacity until July 1985, when you assumed your current post as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Sir, your general responsibilities as Assistant Secretary of State for International American Affairs include the entire Latin American region, am I right?
Latin American and Caribbean.
And the Caribbean. And as you indicated in your opening statement, you are the senior diplomat under the Secretary of State responsible for U.S. diplomacy in the Central American region. Is that correct?
Correct.
You've been the chief manager of our policy in Central America since you assumed your current post in July of 1985.
Certainly at my level, yes.
All right, sir. Your predecessor as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs was Langhorne Motley.
Correct.
When you were appointed to your current post, did you receive any formal briefing in to your new assignment?
Not really in the department. I spoke to, I don't know if you'd call this formal or informal, I spoke to the office director of each office in the Bureau and spent a full day out at CIA headquarters getting briefed by the Mexico people, the Cuba people, and so forth, including the Central American people on all of the issues before the Bureau.
All right, sir. Did you receive any briefing from any office on the Boland Amendment restrictions which were then enforced with respect to our policy in Nicaragua?
I don't recall any specific briefing about the Boland Amendment, but we were all aware of it.
And you, of course, had read the Boland Amendment.
I'm not sure if I'd read it in my previous job, but I read it at that point.
You read it before you began acting in your new post, correct?
Yes.
All right, sir. Did you have a view after reading it as to whether the Boland Amendment restrictions could apply to the National Security Council?
Well, it was my, excuse me, my assumption that they probably would.
That they probably would.
I never checked that with anybody, but that was the working assumption.
And that was your view after reading the statute, correct?
It was my view that we would act as if it applied to everybody.
All right, sir. Now, there was a restricted interagency group, otherwise referred to as the RIG, on Latin America in place when you became Assistant Secretary, correct?
That's right.
Would you describe what that restricted interagency group was?
Yes, very happily, because I have heard an awful lot of inaccurate descriptions of it. In every bureau, in every one of the 5 regional bureaus of the department, there has got to be some mechanism for coordinating interagency activity. I was advised before I took this job that I had to have such, whether it was a coffee once a week with the relevant official or officials of CIA and NSC and DOD, or a dinner once a week, whatever it was, I had to do something. When I arrived at the Bureau, I found that, in fact, Assistant Secretary Modley had such an informal coordinating mechanism, which he called a RIG. I had not previously heard that term, and as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, I had never been aware that this thing existed, much less been invited to it. But it was a group, as it turned out, not of the lead official from each of the 4 agencies, but rather a group of the lead 3 or 4 officials, a group of, that is to say, roughly 15 people. And that seemed to me to be a very good idea. I mean, the purpose of it was to spread information and share views. Therefore, in a sense, the larger the better. So I took it as I received it, and the only change in membership that took place was that I replaced Modley.
As the chairman,
Correct.
which agencies of the government were represented on the rig that you inherited from Assistant Secretary Motley?
CIA, both the Directorate of Operations and the Directorate of Intelligence, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, both the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and my bureau for the department.
How often did the rig meet?
Well, theoretically it met once a week. In fact, looking at my calendar, it really ended up meeting about once every other week.
All right, sir. Were any minutes or other records kept of rig meetings?
Not formally and not by me.
You're not aware of any minutes or records of those
Well,
meetings?
I would bet that some of the other people there took notes. Some of the people from DOD certainly seem to, and there may well be minutes around. There are no official minutes because it wasn't a decision-making body. It was a kind of information sharing and coordinating body.
Was Oliver North a member of the rig under your predecessor?
Yes.
And he continued?
Yes.
Was the chief of the CIA Central American Task Force a member of the rig under both your predecessor and during your tenure?
Yes.
All right, sir. At rig meetings, were there discussions during the period from July 1985 through the fall of 1986 of the private network that was supplying the Contras in their efforts against the Sandinista regime? Was that subject discussed at rig meetings from time to time?
Well, we knew it was there. We tried to get some sense, maintain some sense of what the capabilities of the resistance were, how it was doing badly or well. So that was certainly discussed. How were they doing? There was no discussion of how this network operated, but it was quite obvious that it was out there.
And you knew that it was supplying lethal assistance to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, correct?
That's correct. I think we knew that it was supplying only lethal assistance as time went by because we had a certain amount of intelligence reporting on what in fact was coming in from non-U.S. sources.
Were there discussions at the rig during 1985 and 1986 of the need to open a southern front against the Sandinista regime from Costa Rica?
In the military sense, I don't really recall that. There was certainly discussions of the fact that the preponderance of resistance activity was in the north, and that was a mistake. That was too bad. Partly because the political complexion of the resistance in the south was more attractive in this country and in Europe and in Latin America. It was thought to be a more liberal group in the south. So we were always trying to get those, let me say we in state were always trying to get the resistance people, that is to say the Nicaraguan exiles in the south, more active. I don't recall any real discussion of getting a military southern front going because we weren't in the business of giving military aid.
All right, so were there discussions at the rig meetings in 1985 and 1986 about fundraising efforts for the Contras, either from private parties or from third countries?
I would say not at the rig. There were an endless number of discussions about fundraising from Congress. It was the mechanism by which, until what we used to call the Fortier Group got established in around January or February of '86, it was the mechanism for coordinating our congressional activities. We did not discuss, I think, there the question of fundraising from other countries. We did discuss it once with essentially the same group of people on an airplane flight, I recall, to Central America. We sort of kicked around that idea. That was the only discussion of it that I can recall at what you might call a rig.
All right, we'll get to that later. From whom did the rig get its direction on policy toward Central America, Mr. Abrams?
Well, the rig, as I said, was not a decision-making or policy-making body. It was a coordinating body. Policy was made as usual, in a sense, by the President, by the NSC, by the NSPG, by the Secretary of State.
All right, sir. And to whom did you report?
The Secretary.
How frequent, did you have regular meetings with the Secretary of State?
I had a regular meeting once a week, supplemented by any meetings that I might request, or by, well, let me go back. I had one meeting with him per week on my Bureau's activities. Twice a week, in addition, we had broader meetings of what was called a Regional Assistant Secretaries meeting, where all the Regional Assistant Secretaries would meet, and I could raise with him any matter that I wanted, so that would be 3 times a week, plus whatever other meetings might take place. That is, if there was a foreign minister in town from my region, then I would take him to see the Secretary. So the number of times I saw the Secretary varied a lot.
You had no trouble getting access to the Secretary when you needed to speak to him or report to him?
Correct.
And as you've told us during our interviews, a part of your responsibility as Assistant Secretary was to make judgments on when something ought to be reported upstairs and when it didn't have to be, correct?
It's a very important part. If you keep telling the Secretary things he doesn't need to know, then you're wasting his time. And if you don't tell him things he needs to know, then you're in trouble.
All right, sir. Now, you're aware, and you alluded to it moments ago, that there has been testimony before these committees that the true RIG, true policy implementing group on Central America, was a 3-person RIG consisting of you, Lieutenant Colonel North, and the chief of the CIA's Central American Task Force. Ambassador Tams, among others, was a witness who testified here that that was the true RIG and that it was the source of instructions that he was receiving. How do you respond to those claims and those assertions?
Well, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he never attended a RIG meeting.
Was there a 3-person RIG consisting of you, North, and the chief of the Central America Task Force of the CIA?
There was not.
Was there a de facto working group consisting of those 3 persons who effectively were the action-oriented persons on Central American policy?
No, there was not. There were meetings among the 3 of us, as there were meetings among virtually any combination of 2 or 3 or 4 people within the RIG that you could find. But there was no sub-RIG or something like that.
Do you have any idea where the witnesses who have testified to otherwise received the impression that there was a 3-person sub-RIG or working group that was implementing policy and deciding on policy towards Nicaragua?
Well, I can take a stab at it, and that is that the fact is that I was the point man for the Department of State on this policy, as the task force chief was for CIA, and as in some sense, though that was a disputed sense, Colonel North was for NSC, and we did, by my calendar, about 5 times in 18 months, we did meet, though not alone. So I can see how that might have cropped up in some people's minds.
Sir, from looking at your calendar, by my calculation, during the first 6 months of 1986, there were 4 RIG meetings that might have pertained to Central America. Those are listed as just RIG as opposed to RIG on country X or country Y, which was outside of Central America. 4 RIG meetings that might have pertained to Central America, and 7 meetings listed among you, Oliver North, and the chief of the agency's Central America Task Force. What went on at those 7 meetings of the 3 of you?
I don't believe there were 7 meetings of the 3 of us. My memory is that it would usually be my practice, as I said, to include in meetings a Foreign Service officer. For the most part, that would have been my Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central America. It might on occasion have been others within the Bureau. So I really can't tell you from my calendar how many times North, the task force chief, and I met. We certainly did meet. I would very seriously doubt that it is 7 times, alone without a Foreign Service officer present. Now, what would happen when we did meet?
Yes, sir.
One of the things that we would do, that I would do, would be to make an effort to keep the 2 of them, that is to say the task force chief and Colonel North, working together in harmony, because there was a certain degree of rivalry there. These were the 2 men who knew the resistance leaders best. These were the 2 men whose relationships with them went back a couple of years. And there was a certain degree of rivalry as to who represented their interests, that is to say, who knew what their interests were best, who knew what they wanted best, who knew them best, who had the most accurate reporting on on what their situation was. So that was one thing. It was just a kind of personnel management, you might say. This was also an occasion on which they could, one or the other of them, could say things to me about people who worked for me, if they wanted to, about an ambassador, about somebody in their own bureaucracy, about whom they really didn't want to talk in a larger group. How is so-and-so doing? That kind of thing.
You recognize the two of them as the persons most knowledgeable about the situation in Nicaragua in the government, correct?
Yes.
Was there any other subgrouping of the rig that you met with alone or with a foreign officer on any regular basis? Your calendar doesn't indicate.
I would have met probably with the agency people alone, maybe after meetings. That is, either the chief of the Latin American division or the chief of the task force, or both, would stay behind at a meeting sometimes after a rig meeting.
But, sir, when it came to Nicaragua, there was no other...
No, that would be to discuss Nicaragua.
All right.
But other than that, I would say not.
Now, the discussions that you say you had with Colonel North and the task force chief on you recall 5 occasions meeting with them either alone or with a foreign service officer?
Well, I don't recall it, but I took a look at the date book some time ago, and I think I counted 5.
All right, sir. If it was 5 meetings, at those 5...
It could be 7.
Pardon?
It could be 7.
All right. Those 5 or 7 meetings, your recollection is that the subject matter was essentially turf issues between the CIA and the NSC?
No, I don't actually remember. I can't tell you what the subject matter was at any one of those meetings. I can tell you the kinds of issues which we had to discuss. We had, it's not that we discussed turf issues. It is rather that it was useful to have these discussions because, see, one of the most important parts of my job for the secretary was to try to keep the interagency relationship smooth. If it gets rough, then it gets kicked upstairs and it takes his time dealing with his colleagues in other agencies. So one of the key jobs that I had and have was to keep interagency relationships good, and I think they are. And one of the ways of accomplishing that was to meet with these people.
At any of the sessions, 5 or 7, of the task force chief, you and Colonel North, and perhaps a foreign service officer, did you discuss the military situation with respect to the Contras and the Sandinistas?
I have no doubt that we did. It would be odd if we did not.
Did you discuss at any of those sessions the construction of a secret airfield in Costa Rica as part of the Contra supply effort?
I don't believe so.
All right. Did you discuss the activities directed towards opening a southern front against the Sandinistas at those sessions with the task force chief and Lieutenant Colonel North?
Again, we would not have discussed opening a southern front. We would certainly have discussed the situation in the South. That is, how were the resistance fighters in the South doing? What was their situation? Their supplies or lack of supplies, their military success or lack of it, their political cohesion or lack of it. We certainly would have talked about that.
And lastly, sir, on this point, if there was something you wanted to find out about the Contras or the private network that was supplying them, you would have turned to Colonel North or to the task force chief?
Usually. I mean, it would depend. There were issues which were more political in nature where I might have turned as well to one of our embassies, but the two people who knew most about it were North and the task force chief, and I would usually have turned to them.
All right, sir. Now, the Department of State has a Bureau of Intelligence and Research, does it not?
Correct.
Referred to as INR?
Correct.
What is the function of that bureau?
The function of that bureau is to provide a view which is not the agency's view of intelligence matters. That is to say, they do not generate intelligence. Intelligence is generated by agency people in the field, department people in the field, DOD people in the field, but they analyze it separately from the analysis which is done at DOD and CIA and come up with their own analyses.
When you became Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs, Mort Abramowitz was the person in charge of INR at that time?
You know, I think not. I don't remember when he came in.
All right.
Maybe.
Do you recall, though, that Ambassador Frank McNeil was the Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary in INR in 1985?
I think that's right.
All right, sir. Under your predecessor, INR was represented at the RIG meetings on Central America, was it not?
I do not believe so.
Well, sir, was it decided during your term that INR representatives would not attend RIG meetings?
It was decided to maintain the rig exactly as it was. A very large number of people wanted to get in, and I made the decision to bar the door, that is, to maintain it as it had been, partly because I felt you really couldn't make exceptions. If people from the department outside of ARA, which is the initials for my bureau, were going to get in, then they were all going to get in. So we didn't let anybody, we represented the department.
All right. Was there a reason that you didn't want anybody from the State Department's INR bureau at those RIG meetings?
Well, there was a reason we didn't want anybody from any other bureau, which was that we thought you really couldn't make invidious comparisons among bureaus. We had requests from others to attend as well. For example, the Bureau of Politico-Military Affairs put on a very strong push. The OAS mission put on a very strong push. And I just decided no.
All right, sir. Did you consider that INR had a biased view towards the situation in Nicaragua?
Oh, I think I would have said that Ambassador McNeil had a biased view.
And what did you perceive to be that bias?
A bias against the policy which we were conducting.
All right, sir. You first met Oliver North on a trip to Central America in 1983 or 1984?
I looked it up once. I think it was November '83.
All right. And the next time you dealt with him was after you became Assistant Secretary in the Inter-American Affairs Bureau, yes?
No, I think that's not right.
When did you deal with him again, sir?
In the fall of I'd say the fall of '84, if I remember right. Again, this comes from the calendar. The late Mr. Fortier called a meeting. I'm really not sure of the timing, but I was in any event in the Human Rights Bureau, called a meeting. My calendar does not show what the purpose of the meeting was, but I think it was probably to talk about Central America, about public perceptions. Anyway, Mr. Fortier called a meeting, and I attended, and a bunch of other people attended, but one of them was Colonel North.
All right, sir. You began to work...
I should say, let me just add,
Sure.
We also, my data shows, had 1 or 2 or 3 connections, I don't remember the number, when I had been named to this job, but had not yet been confirmed and sworn in. That's the spring of '85.
All right. Once you began functioning as Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs, you worked closely with Colonel North on Central American matters, correct?
That is correct.
You could speak to him when you needed to, assuming he was around?
Well, that's right. He was out of the country a lot, but when he was around, reasonably quickly.
All right. And, sir, as you've said in the past, you believe that Colonel North had more information about the private network that was supplying the Contras even than the CIA did. Am I correct?
Correct.
All right, sir. And he was the closest person, so far as you could tell, and as you've testified in the past, to the private benefactors who were raising funds in this country in support of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, correct?
That's correct. He certainly knew the most about them, or seemed to.
Now, during your period from July 1985 through October 1986, what did you know concerning the nature of Colonel North's efforts regarding fundraising in this country on behalf of the Contras?
I knew that he knew more about it than we in the department did, and that he seemed to know more about it than CIA did. He once told me, for example, that there was a big network out there of people and companies and bank accounts, which nobody else ever said to me. So, I mean, that is the kind of thing that led to my having the view that he knew more about it than others did.
By the way, when he said that, did you ask him for details about that big network?
No.
Ask him about the bank accounts or how he knew about them?
No.
Why not?
I was not his supervisor. He worked for a different agency. I was supervising my people. I did ask him at a couple of occasions, and I cannot place the exact dates, whether he was abiding by the law. And on one occasion in particular, I remember he said, I have never solicited a nickel, may have said a dime. I am not breaking the law. I have checked with White House counsel. Or I'm not quoting, but words to that effect. I have run this by White House counsel. And it was not my practice, is not my practice, has not been, except now, when I am authorized and really compelled to do so by law, to try to reach out and supervise the activities of these coordinate agencies, least of all the White House.
When he told you that what he was doing was legal, did you know what he was doing?
Well, I assumed I knew what he was doing.
And what did you assume that he was doing?
I assumed that he was trying to keep track of all those people out there and what they were doing. For example, I assumed that there was not one General Singlaub, but rather that there were a number of what you might call Singlaub-type operations. That is to say, people who supported the resistance and who were actively raising funds for the resistance, and that the person who knew most about all of those efforts was Colonel North.
Well, did you ever ask Colonel North specifically what he was doing with respect to fundraising for the Contras?
No, I think you have to remember, first of all, he told me that he had run this he had gotten some legal advice. Secondly, comment had been made on this by the National Security Advisor to the Congress, saying that he was not, I don't remember the exact words, but directing or coordinating or something like that. And so what I assumed he was doing was essentially monitoring. That is, he was trying to keep track. And that was important because we needed to have at least a general sense of what they had. Now, as the months rolled by, Congress began to roll back, I'm starting in July '85, began to roll back the limitations on CIA. And with each rollback, the amount of information we received from CIA grew with respect to what was being received. By '86, we were actually getting CIA reports that said, today 3,000 rifles arrived, and that sort of thing.
Sir, you were aware, as you've testified in the past, of constant rumors and reports that Colonel North was engaged in fundraising for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, correct?
That's correct.
And as you've also testified, everybody involved in the rig, according to your testimony, knew that North was somehow connected with the private fundraising, but did not know exactly how, correct?
Correct.
And you've also said that with that knowledge of those reports, and I'm quoting you, most of us were careful not to ask North lots of questions, correct? That
Correct.
was your position? Why were
Correct.
you careful not to ask Lieutenant Colonel North lots of questions or any questions about specifically what he was doing to support the Contras?
Well, I'd give two responses, really. First of all, I thought, especially after Mr. McFarland had flatly so stated to Congress and after Colonel North had flatly so stated to me, that he was not soliciting funds, nor was he kind of directing the solicitation of funds. He had said that straight to me, and Mr. McFarland had said it in pretty categorical terms to Congress. So that was out. Secondly, it's been my experience in this program that whenever I reached out, I paid a price for it. And we were jumping ahead, but let me just give an example of it. I do recall when General Singlaub asked to see me in April. And I remember saying to myself, I don't have any reason to see General Singlaub. I don't have any business with General Singlaub. And maybe I'll get in trouble if I say to General Singlaub, okay, come see me. But I have been a great admirer of General Singlaub, still am. And so I thought, well, if he wants to see me, fine. I thought, I'm going to get accused of facilitation if I see General Singlaub, even if I don't do anything for General Singlaub. Well, sure enough, I didn't do anything for General Singlaub, and I have been accused of facilitation. The atmosphere was one of such great controversiality in the policy, so many accusations being thrown around, so much difficulty in understanding precisely what the limits of the law were, that it was certainly not conducive to having people trying to supervise activities which were not theirs and for which they had no responsibility.
You felt you'd be damned either way.
I felt I would be, and in the case of Singlaub, I have been.
Sir, did you also feel that a hands-off policy was the best way of complying with the Boland Amendment, that there were certain things that you've said you didn't want to know.
Well, the Boland Amendment, I believe, perversely and against the intention of the drafters, had that impact, at least part of the time. That is, that I knew that nothing the State Department was doing, or thought I knew, nothing the State Department was doing could possibly be considered a violation of the Boland Amendment. That was my main concern. My behavior and the people who worked for me, first in the Bureau and then in the embassies, that was my main concern with respect to Boland. Again, the responsibility is greater now.
Is it true, sir, that your position was that there were certain things you did not want to know?
I would say that that I wanted to know what my people were doing in detail. They were to report to me. I was their supervisor. With respect to people in other agencies, as long as I was sure they were not violating the law, that was what I needed to know, and I didn't need to know the details beyond that.
And that included Colonel North?
Oh, sure.
Do you recall what it was that caused you to go to Colonel North and ask him if what he was doing was legal?
I assume it was one of these press reports.
Do you recall whether the Secretary of State shared your view that it was best for you not to ask or to know what Colonel North was doing specifically?
We had a conversation in around Labor Day 1985 in which my memory is that I said something to him like, all these accusations about Colonel North, you want me to try to find out whether they're true and what he's up to? Or do you want me to sort of leave that? And he said, no, you've got to know. The note that I have in my notebook says, monitor Ollie. And I thought that I had, in fact, met that responsibility, first by his assurances that he was not soliciting, second by Mr. McFarland's assurances to Congress, and third by the fact that we worked together, and it seemed to me, we had these rigged meetings, seemed to me that I had a pretty good grasp on what he was doing.
You went to the Secretary of State, raised the subject of North's possible connection with fundraising for lethal aid on that occasion, which I believe was September 4, 1985. Correct, sir?
I think that's right.
And the Secretary of State told you that we, the State Department, don't want to be in the dark. Do you recall that?
I don't recall the exact words, but that's certainly the general sense of it.
Yes, sir. He told you that you were the overall manager of the Central American picture, correct?
Again, I don't remember the exact words.
But in substance, that's what
I think so.
And he told you, therefore, that you ought to, as your own note of the meeting records, you ought to monitor Ollie, correct?
Correct.
Now, did you tell the Secretary of State at that meeting that you didn't think you needed to monitor Ollie, or that you believed you had already monitored him sufficiently by asking him whether he was soliciting and hearing that he wasn't?
No, because that wasn't true.
All right.
The monitor Ollie is not an activity that you do one morning. It is a...
That's for sure.
It is a behavior pattern, let's put it that way. And again, I think that I did that through at least three actions. Three things happened, one of which was that I asked him. Another thing was that Mr. McFarland, don't forget when the Secretary, I believe, when the Secretary said that to me, I did not, and he did not have, at least I did not have, the National Security Advisor's categorical assurances to Congress that none of this was going on. You had press stories saying, is this going on? I'm not so sure I would have asked the Secretary that if the day before the National Security Advisor had said all that stuff in the press. Not true.
What did you do to monitor Ollie and follow his behavior pattern after your meeting with the Secretary of State?
Well, we had relatively regular meetings at the rig. We had phone calls on an irregular but continuing basis. We had conversations on a couple of occasions in which I asked him what he was doing, and I thought I had a pretty good grasp of what he was doing.
All right. Did you ever ask him, though, for specifics about what his connection was with the private network that was supplying the Contras?
Not in so many words. I thought I knew what he was doing. I thought that he was, well, the best word is monitoring.
All right, sir. Now, do you recall reading an article in the Miami Herald about Colonel North's actions in or about the end of April 1986, and I'll refer you to Exhibit 33.
I did not recall this, but I was looking at the exhibit book downstairs before, so I took a look at it about half an hour ago.
And having looked at that
Hour ago.
article, which is entitled "Colonel's Actions May Have Broken Contra Aid Ban," do you recall having read it around the time it was published?
Well, I know that I wrote a memo about it, so that, but the answer is I don't actually recall it.
All right, sir. And that memo appears as Exhibit 44 in your binder. And this is a memo that you wrote to Mr. Abramowitz, who by then was the head of the State Department's Bureau of I&R, correct, sir?
Correct.
Now, this article reported sources asserting that Colonel North was directly involved in supplying or facilitating the supply of lethal aid to the freedom fighters, correct?
Well, I'd have to look at it.
Please, Exhibit 33.
How did you characterize it?
This was an article that asserted that Colonel North, according to sources, was involved in some way in facilitating the provision of lethal aid to the Contras.
I think that's fair.
Is that correct? It also reported on Rob Owen, who was then working with the State Department's Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office, correct? You see that at the end?
Yeah,
of the...
I'm not sure when the contract ended, but
But it did contain reports about Rob Owen and his association with this effort, correct?
yes.
And, sir, the nature of the memo that you wrote in response to this article to Mr. Abramowitz, Exhibit 44, was to complain about the fact that part of this report apparently had come from someone in the State Department, correct?
No, it was not exactly.
All right, sir,
It
how
was
would
to
you
complain-
characterize your memo?
It was to complain about the fact that a State Department intelligence analyst, that is to say an employee of his, was cited in the article, not the first time. See, whenever there was what I would consider to be a leak or an unauthorized contact with the press, in my bureau, I immediately contacted the Security Bureau and asked for an investigation. In every one of those, in every one that I can recall, they would then come around and interview me, interview my deputies, interview the office directors in an effort to find out who was doing this. Now, here was an example of somebody who did not work for me, who apparently worked for Mort Abramowitz, who was engaging in the same kind of thing, taking what I would consider to be cheap shots, inaccurate cheap shots at the program. It was not the first time that had happened. I recall other instances of newspaper articles or of hearing from people outside of a newspaper article that somebody in INR had said something or other. And there is no real function for INR to brief the press on things. And so I decided on this occasion to complain about it. And the way to complain about it is not really to go to the Security Bureau. That is what I really did for my bureau. But rather to go to Ambassador Abramowitz and say, hey.
Somebody in your bureau is leaking.
Essentially, I think that's a fair summary.
Now, did you believe there was somebody in the...
Worse than leaking, because, you know, leaking at least is frequently accurate, and this seemed to me to be inaccurate. That's why it seemed to me to be an attack on the program, and a really unfair one.
Sir, is there anything in the memo that you wrote to Mr. Abramowitz, Exhibit 44, that says that what was contained in the Miami Herald article was inaccurate or false in any way?
No.
All right, sir. I'd like to talk to you briefly about Ambassador Tams. Did you have any conversations with Ambassador Tams before he took up his post as ambassador to Costa Rica in the summer of 1985?
Yes, sir. It is customary when an ambassador is going out to his post for him to meet with his assistant secretary. And at some point in the spring, I had such a meeting with him. It took place in my office as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights.
And what did you discuss on that occasion?
We discussed Costa Rica. We discussed mostly Costa Rica in the context of the regional security problem, that is, in the context of Nicaragua, and we talked about regional policy, I think, more than we did. I didn't know really enough to talk about, and I'm not sure he did, Costa Rican politics, Costa Rican economics, and so forth. So we really talked more about the regional issues.
All right, sir. Did you ever tell Ambassador Tams, either on that occasion or any time subsequently, that one of his missions as ambassador to Costa Rica was to assist the opening of a southern military front in Nicaragua against the Sandinista regime?
At no time whatsoever.
Did Ambassador Tams ever tell you that any such instruction had been given to him by Colonel North or anyone else?
He did not. However, the circumstances of Ambassador Tams' departure were somewhat bizarre. In the fall of 1986, President Arias came to the U.S. for an official visit. The morning of, or perhaps the day before, I don't recall exactly, the visit, and without any notice to the Department of State, none whatsoever, Ambassador Tams announced to his staff in San Jose at the embassy, "I quit." My mission was to found a Southern Front. I was sent here to set up a Southern Front. I have completed that mission, and therefore it is time for me to go. We found out about it because a member of the staff telephoned the department and said, "Hey, do you know that Ambassador Tams just resigned?" And we said no. And in fact, we don't have an ambassador in Costa Rica today, in part because having had no notice, no lead time, we haven't been able to get somebody in place and confirmed and so forth. Still working on that. So I knew at that point, that is the day of the Arias, he then told President Arias on the airplane while they were flying up here, again before he had told the department. So I found out at that point that he believed that this was his mission in Costa Rica.
Have you ever discussed that belief with him? Personally,
I don't believe
directly?
I have talked to him. Well, we saw each other during the visit, but the answer to your question is no.
All right, sir.
I
Now,
should say, by the way, that it is not my practice, with one exception, it is not my practice to meet with people alone. Being part of a hierarchy, it's important to spread information both up and down and sideways, and that is a lot easier to do if there's somebody who's a note-taker. The meeting with Ambassador Tams, to which I referred in the spring of '85, had present the desk officer for Costa Rica.
did Colonel North ever tell you that he had discussed opening a southern military front with Ambassador Tams?
No, sir.
Did you ever hear anything like that from the task force chief?
No.
All right.
It was part of the duties of all of our ambassadors in Central America to support the resistance. We're now talking about the summer of 1985. I read in my opening statement from the policy of the United States as enacted by Congress, and Congress had just approved $27 million for us to distribute to support a fighting force. So it was the duty of every ambassador to support U.S. policy, to try to get the government of the country to which he was assigned, this wasn't true only in Central America, but most importantly in Central America, to support that policy. And Ambassador Tams certainly had that responsibility and the responsibility of working with the resistance in Costa Rica. He did not have the responsibility to, quote, set up a southern front, close quote.
So you just referred to Congress having approved $27 million to support a fighting force, correct?
Yes.
Are you referring to the $27 million in humanitarian aid that Congress approved in the summer of 1985?
I am.
All right, sir. Now, Ambassador Tams did receive written instructions before he took up his assignment in Costa Rica, did he not?
Every ambassador does, and he received a letter from the Secretary similarly.
And is that letter, parts of it that have been declassified in any event, Exhibit 27 in your binder?
Yes.
All right, sir. And at the end of that letter, the Secretary states, in the second to last paragraph, "I know that in the course of your duties, you will have contact with many officials on a variety of matters, and you will receive solicited and unsolicited advice and counsel on actions you should take. I want to emphasize that the line of authority runs from the President through me to Assistant Secretary Abrams." And so was that your understanding as well of the line of authority?
That's right. I should say that that is known as the Motley Clause. Ambassador Motley, as Assistant Secretary, had had trouble on at least one occasion with ambassadors reporting to the White House. And he had then adopted the practice of asking the Secretary to put that clause in letters of instruction to ambassadors in the Latin American Caribbean region to make sure that they understood exactly how they were to report.
All right, sir. And then in the final paragraph of the letter, still same Exhibit 27, the Secretary writes to Ambassador Thames, quote, "I have directed Assistant Secretary Abrams to issue instructions in my name and serve as the primary communications link between me and the Chiefs of Mission in his area of responsibility. You should channel all messages dealing with policy proposals, policy implementation, program activities, and post-operations to or through him, with the understanding that for extraordinary situations, there are channels of direct communication with me that are available for your use," close quote. And you understood that to be the case as well in terms of how Ambassador Thames ordinarily should be communicating with the department, correct?
Two comments, if I can. First, just to draw your attention to page 1 of the letter, in which U.S. objectives in Costa Rica are set forth. There are 4 listed. None of them is open a southern front. But secondly, Ambassador Thames testified that if you wanted to keep something secret, you wouldn't send it through State Department channels. That is false. We are able to maintain in the department adequate secrecy through the use of a variety of channels available to every ambassador. We'll come to Brunei later, but there's an example of something which we maintained absolutely secret using a particular State Department channel. Ambassadors are supposed to report in State Department channels.
And you never told Ambassador Thames otherwise?
Absolutely not.
And you never sent a message to him through anyone from the CIA that he ought to report on different or back channels to you?
I don't send messages to ambassadors through the CIA. That is what State Department communication channels are for. In my experience, when you have an ambassador reporting through the CIA, what you've got is an ambassador who's kind of been taken over by a station chief.
All right, sir. Did you, in fact, receive, aside from the cable which we'll get to concerning Aden Pastora and General Singlaub, aside from that, did you receive back-channel communications? Ambassador Thames via the CIA?
Well, there's one in here in the book. Very rare to receive a back-channel communication from any ambassador. You know, as I think, for example, of a more active embassy, El Salvador, I cannot recall really receiving a back-channel. In the case of Ambassador Thames, my memory of his testimony is that he sent 2 or 3, and 2 or 3 over 18 months is conceivable to me.
All right, sir. Did you ever discuss with Ambassador Thames on any occasion when you were in Costa Rica, or if he was in the United States, exactly what he was doing as ambassador to Costa Rica to facilitate or help the resistance?
Oh, I'm sure we did. I'm sure we discussed it both in my visits to Costa Rica and in his visits to Washington. He would have made normally he would have made a couple. And in cable traffic as well.
What did Ambassador Thames tell you that he was doing?
My impression was that he was doing essentially what he should be doing. That is,
what?
He should be in contact. I mean, when I say he and his staff at the embassy should be in contact with the significant elements of the resistance who were living in Costa Rica. We were, generally speaking, pursuing a policy of trying to promote unity on the part of all of the Nicaraguan resistance elements. We wanted them all to cooperate with each other. In fact, at one point we told them that this would be sort of March '86, that to qualify for aid from the United States, one of the things that you needed to do was to be willing to work with the other resistance elements. So that was one thing. Another thing he had to do, he had many duties that did not relate to the resistance. We're not talking about that. But with respect to the resistance, for example, he had to try to monitor, to some degree, drug trafficking charges to make sure that there were none such. There was no drug trafficking being conducted by people in the resistance. That was another one of his responsibilities. He had to talk to the government of Costa Rica because, for one thing, we did not want them to throw all Nicaraguan refugees out of Costa Rica, which they did not do. That was the kind of thing that he was supposed to be doing, which I think he did do.
Did there come a time that you learned that one of the things he was doing was talking to the Costa Rican government about the construction of an airstrip at a site known as Point West to be used in Contra supply?
Yes.
When did you first learn of that proposed airstrip project?
Well, I learned of the project rather earlier than I learned of his involvement with the Costa Rican government. Of that I learned when he testified here. I learned of that I learned of the existence of the airstrip probably in August, being that I was sworn in late in July, probably in August of '85, maybe September of '85, but that's the time period.
How did you learn of the project at that time?
I don't recall any conversation in particular in which I was told of it. As you know, the former station chief has testified that I told him that it was Colonel North. That's perfectly logical and plausible to me.
You don't recall whether you learned about the airstrip from Colonel North or from someone in the agency?
That's correct. I don't recall.
What do you recall learning?
That there was an airstrip being built by the private benefactors, as we used to call them, in Costa Rica, that this was a project which was either underway or about to be underway, period.
Did you learn whether the United States government or any U.S. government officials were involved in that project?
Well, it was pretty clear from the way it was told to me that no U.S. government officials were involved in the project, and that would have been illegal.
Well, did someone tell you specifically that no U.S. government officials were involved?
I doubt that it was said in so many words. It was obvious that no U.S. government officials could be involved.
How was it obvious?
Because it would have been illegal.
And therefore you assumed that no one was involved?
Yes.
Did you ever ask Colonel North whether he was involved in the airstrip project or with the private benefactors who were constructing it?
No.
All right, sir. Now, how did you assume, from what you were told, that these private American citizens were going to get the permission of the Costa Rican government to build an airstrip to help the Contras?
I didn't make an assumption.
Well, did you have
I
any...
was told that the way I was told that there was an airstrip that was being built or about to be built. I don't think it actually occurred to me that they needed to ask, what about the Costa Rican government?
Well, did you have a conversation with the...
There are, I should say, there are in Central America and the Caribbean probably hundreds of privately owned airstrips, and I'm not even sure that you need government permission.
Well, this was going to be more than a privately owned airstrip, wasn't it, Mr. Abrams?
It was supposed to be, as I recall what I was told, it was an airstrip that was to be used well, I don't know whether it was to be used by the resistance or whether it was to be used by the benefactors, but it was to be used at least by the benefactors for the resistance, so it's not much of a difference.
It was to be used on behalf of the armed resistance to the
Precisely.
Sandinistas, correct?
Precisely.
So not your average private airstrip. Now...
Well, a lot of the private airstrips are used by drug traffickers, so that...
but you didn't assume this was going to be a drug trafficking
I
airport.
was told, as I recall it,
All right.
This is an airstrip that is being built, again, I can't say whether it's for the use of the resistance, but it is the purpose of it is to help the resistance, let's put it that way.
All right, sir. Now, didn't you assume, as indeed you've told us, that the Costa Rican government would have to give permission for such an airstrip to be built and used for that purpose to aid the resistance?
I don't know that it ever occurred to me. If you ask me the question, I think the answer is yes.
But you didn't think about that at the time?
I don't think so.
Sir, you knew that the senior CIA representative in Costa Rica was involved in some way with the airstrip?
I did not.
You knew he was knowledgeable about it?
I did not.
Well, sir, didn't there come a time in the fall of 1985 when you were in Costa Rica meeting with the senior CIA representative and two of his assistants, correct?
That is correct.
And you asked him, what about the airstrip, because you were surprised he hadn't mentioned it to you. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And because you were surprised, weren't you surprised because you believed that he knew about the airstrip?
I was surprised because I had spent at least, I would say by memory, at least an hour with the station chief and two of his staff members. And they gave me what was purported by them and believed by me to be a totally complete briefing on everything going on in Costa Rica. There wasn't supposed to be a lawn getting mowed in Costa Rica without them knowing about it. I have since I was new in the job, and I had kind of exaggerated the degree to which we can know what is going on in another country, but that was my view. And they gave me a full, complete, total briefing, and I knew something that they didn't seem to know. I had been told that there was an airstrip being built. Now, come on. How is it possible that they did not know this? So I said to the station chief when the briefing was theoretically over, isn't there an airstrip being built someplace? And I believe he has testified correctly that he nearly had a cardiac. I mean, I thought he was going to actually fall off his chair. And he looked at me, and he looked at the two guys, and he looked at me, and he looked at the two guys, and it became apparent that his real concern was them, and he said something to the effect that they don't know about that, or they didn't know about that. They knew about it then. It just seemed to me obvious that if somebody's building I mean, he was supposed to be reporting on things like this, and it was very odd to me that he didn't know about it. Of course, he did know about it, and he said to me, yes, these two guys didn't know about that, yes, and he showed me. My memory is he actually had a map, or we had a map, or there was a map in the room, and he showed me where it was, and he said something to the effect that it isn't open yet, or it isn't started yet, or in other words, this is an airstrip which is not in use, was what stayed in my mind, and that was the end of that.
Did you ask the station chief why it was such a secret from others who were working with him?
No, I had no reason to question who in his station he was telling what.
Did you ask the station chief whether anybody from our government was involved in the construction of the airstrip?
No, had been presented to me, I think, as a private benefactor effort, and
Did
I did not assume that, and do not assume, people are violating the law.
Did I hear you correctly say a few moments ago that the first time you knew that Ambassador Tams had spoken to the Costa Rican government or negotiated with the government about the airstrip was when he testified here last week?
That's correct. He never reported that to the Department of State.
Did you ever ask him, once you found out about the airstrip, whether he had had any contact with the Costa Rican government about that matter?
No, it would never have occurred to me that an ambassador would do something like that without checking with the department.
Well, did you ask him to check with the Costa Rican government as to their knowledge or approval of the airstrip?
No.
That was something you wanted to stay away from?
No, it was, I mean, if some group of private benefactors had gotten permission to do this, you know, here you get into it again. That was exactly the kind of thing where you start put yourself in the middle of that, what may have been a negotiation between the benefactors, what seemed to be, and the Costa Rican government. That's exactly where you're going to get accused of facilitating.
So you had a situation where there seemed...
And I had no reason to believe that Ambassador Tams had done that. None.
At the time, what you believed was that there may have been a negotiation between private Americans and the Costa Rican government.
Or none whatsoever.
But there may have been, correct?
Yes.
And that was something you did not choose to ask further about, correct?
That is correct. That is exactly the kind of thing that I think I would be accused of facilitating for thrusting myself in the middle of.
Did you think that if you did thrust yourself in the middle of something like that, it might set back the project and hurt the resistance?
Well, I don't know. I suppose it might have.
Sir, you've testified in the past that you believe that...
It would. I'm just thinking about your question.
Sure.
Sure, because then you'd be faced with one of two possibilities. Either you tell the Costa Ricans, this is just great, and then in a sense you are facilitating. Or else you don't tell them it's just great, and then you make them nervous, so what do you gain?
Sir, you've testified in the past that you believed that Colonel North was the person who would know most of the answers about the airstrip, correct?
I don't know that I testified about that. He knew more about the private benefactors, I think, than we at State or anybody at CIA seemed to know.
Including the airstrip?
Well, if it is correct, I think that is correct, yeah.
Yeah, that is what you testified to the
think it's
Tower
correct.
Board. Did you ask Colonel North at any time for details about who the private benefactors were who were building the airstrip, whether they had negotiated with the Costa Rican government, any of those details?
No.
All right, sir. When you learned that the airstrip was going to be constructed, did you report that to the Secretary of State?
No.
Why not?
Not important. Private benefactors were presumably doing a whole lot of things. I mean, they were sending machine guns and bullets and all kinds of things into Central America. That was generally common knowledge. It was known by us, it was known by the Congress, that there should be, in addition to this, use of an airstrip in Central America to facilitate their activities. I mean, surprise, surprise.
So you did not report it to the Secretary of State?
No.
Now, sir, do you recall jumping ahead in time to September 1986, receiving a telephone call from Colonel...
Jumping ahead to...
September 1986, that you received a telephone call from Colonel North telling you that there was going to be a press conference held by an official of Costa Rica to discuss the airstrip.
Well, I don't remember the exact date, but yes, I remember the call.
And tell me what you remember about that call and what happened.
Well, as I recall, it was a Friday night. It was late. It was about 11 o'clock. And he called and said, do you remember that there was an airstrip and that this airstrip would at that point have not been in use because there was no Contra military activity underway in Costa Rica, really after May 8th, after the inauguration of President Arias. Yes, I remembered that. Well, the Minister of Public Security, he said, was going to give a press conference, and he was going to talk about the airstrip, and he was going to reveal all sorts of things about the airstrip, including apparently what role, if any, I shouldn't say if any, what role he was apparently going to say the previous government of Costa Rica had approving it or so forth. And this was a very bad thing, he said, and it would do no one any good, and it would raise all sorts of awkward questions about the previous government, and we ought to try to stop it. And I said, I agree with that. And he said, well, what we need to do is let me get Tams on the line, and would you instruct Tams to call President Arias and tell him not to have this press conference? I said, I will. Sounds right to me. So he called back, I don't know, half an hour later, something like that, with Ambassador Tams on the line. Ambassador Tams, I remembered, was in the U.S. I believe he testified he was in West Virginia, which I think is my memory. And we explained this to Tams, that is, that there was going to be this press conference. It had nothing to do with the use of the airstrip. The airstrip, as far as I knew, was long since, you're talking about September, so it's May to September, out of use. But there was no good going to come out of that press conference for the United States or for Costa Rica. Would you please call President Arias? I said. Call him up and ask him not to allow that, cancel the press conference. Tell your Minister of Public Security not to hold that press conference with an implied threat. This was, this was before his official visit to the U.S. I don't recall whether at that moment we knew when he was coming, but the issue of his official visit was in the air. And I instructed Ambassador Tams to advert to the visit in a way which made it clear to President Arias that his visit was at risk. That is to say, something like, this is a needless, a gratuitous complication of U.S.-Costa Rican relations. It is an exceedingly odd thing to do, gratuitously, in the period when we are all contemplating an official visit. I mean, it was supposed to be diplomatic, but the message was also supposed to be clear. And Ambassador Tams said...
Almost a contradiction in terms.
No. You've got to be a good diplomat. Get the message through clearly. And so he said, I will do that. And there was another conversation. Then an hour or two later, midnight, 1 o'clock, something like that, in which Ambassador Tams reported he had done so, and the press conference was canceled. That was the end of that night's activities.
All right, so now you're aware that Colonel North has written a prof message in which he says that he spoke to the head of state in Costa Rica, had a conversation with him, and conveyed the threat, or at least the notion, that the aid might be cut off if this press conference took place. Do you have any knowledge as to whether Colonel North had such a conversation with the Chief of State of Costa Rica? Well, to my personal knowledge, I don't. I do know that President Arias has flatly denied it, and that Colonel North did not tell me that he had had such a conversation. Now, sir, one other question on that. If the airstrip was purely private, the airstrip in Costa Rica, private benefactors exclusively, no U.S. government involvement, why would it have been, as you just testified, an unfriendly act by the Costa Rican government to announce the existence of that airstrip?
It raised and raises issues about the involvement of the prior Costa Rican government, which not only would seem to be delicate, but are. And in fact, we right now have all sorts of communications from the current government of Costa Rica, which are very delicate, about its predecessor's activities. Let me add something else.
Sure.
I viewed this activity in preventing that news conference as an absolutely legitimate diplomatic activity of mine. So much so that within a day or two after that, reminding myself or learning that Ambassador Habib was about to go to San Jose, I asked him to raise this with President Arias. I explained the situation to Ambassador Habib and said to him, would you sort of raise it with President Arias again and say to him, look, who is going to benefit from such a press conference and the raising of all sorts of questions about what your predecessor did? The issue is not U.S. government involvement. The issue is the involvement of the Costa Rican government with the resistance, neutrality, all of that. Who is going to gain by this? And Ambassador Habib did so.
Well, given that your view that this was purely private, didn't it strike you as odd that it was Colonel North who called you and told you that he had found out about the press conference or the forthcoming press conference and was upset about it?
No, because, as I said, he was the guy who seemed to have the most knowledge of the private benefactors. If you think it through, if I think it through right now, it seems to me, I don't know that I've ever seen testimony on this, but the logic of it is to me that one of them may have called him.
One of the private benefactors?
Perfectly, that seems to me probably the most plausible explanation, unless he got it from a U.S. official in Costa Rica.
Some private American citizen who was wired into the Costa Rican government.
I don't know if he told me. I just don't recall if he told me during that conversation where he had heard this, and I don't recall the prof note either, whether it says in the prof note where he got that information.
All right, sir, but it wasn't something that you thought about at the time, that it was Colonel North who was calling to sound the alarm about this forthcoming press conference?
No, because what was important was this press conference was going to complicate U.S.-Costa Rican relations, and indeed, in the event, it did.
All right, sir. When did you first have a meeting with General Singlaub? Do you recall?
Well, I recall having looked through my notes. April 24th, 1986.
All right, sir. And when did you first learn of an agreement that General Singlaub had entered into with Aden Pastora?
Ambassador Tam sent a back-channel cable which gave the text of such an agreement.
All right, that's Exhibit X, EAX, which is dated at the end of March 1986. Ought to be the first exhibit in your book. Is that
Yeah.
the cable?
Well, I don't remember the cable in particular, but I guess so.
I believe that's the cable.
I'll take your word for
I
it.
wouldn't lead you wrong on that.
I know you would not.
Okay. And that, when you received that cable, that was the first you knew of the agreement?
That's correct.
All right, sir. Now,
That is the first I knew of this agreement between the United States and Eden Pastora.
Well, let me just take it one step further. It's also the first time you knew of any agreement between Singlaub and Aden Pastora.
Of any agreement, yes.
All right. The reason I'm trying to be specific, sir, is because, as you know, General Singlaub has testified to the committees that he discussed his proposed agreement with Pastora with you in a meeting before he went to Costa Rica.
We discussed at that April 24th meeting, I think, Eden Pastora. Let me just take a second on this.
Sure.
Basically, Colonel North and the CIA hated Pastora with great passion. They had concluded on the basis of their dealings with him that he was not only untrustworthy, but conceivably disloyal. And they wanted to have literally nothing to do with him. And General Singlaub, as you know from his testimony, thought that was an extremely short-sighted view. I also believe that that was an extremely, I came to believe that was an extremely short-sighted view, and came to disagree with Colonel North and with the task force chief with respect to Mr. Pastora. I don't know whether, I really don't remember whether Singlaub came to me on this because he had heard that I was more sympathetic, or I became more sympathetic in part because of what General Singlaub said. In any event, it is certainly the case that in that meeting in April, we talked about Pastora.
We'll get to that in a moment, but it is your testimony that you did not meet with General Singlaub before he went to see Pastora.
No, no, no. I've got the dates wrong. Before he saw Pastora, yeah, I think my first meeting with him was April 24th.
Your calendar indicates...
Yeah, I had never met him before that. I think that's right.
So in your view, General Singlaub is mistaken in his testimony that he, A, met with you before he went to see Pastora, and B, advised you at that time about the agreement he intended to enter into with Pastora.
Yes, I can only go by the documentary evidence and my memory, and both indicate that we did not discuss this prior to his trip to Central America.
All right, sir. In any event, after you received Exhibit X, the back-channel cable from Ambassador Tams, you became angry at what you read, correct?
I sure did.
And you reflected that in EA Exhibit 1, the cable which was sent back to Ambassador Tams and signed over Deputy Secretary Whitehead's name, correct?
This was the toned-down version.
All right. And what was the source of your aggravation?
Well, look at X. Look at that
right.
exhibit. I mean, it's unbelievable. The United States will provide boots, food, ammunition, medicine, maps, encrypted communications. First of all, military needs. First of all, who is General Singlaub to negotiate on behalf of the United States? Secondly, and more incredibly, what is a U.S. ambassador doing saying, this looks Jim Dandy? Thirdly, talk about violations of the Bolin Amendment. Jesus. This is a promise to send military, I mean, it's unbelievable.
All right.
It wasn't just my personal reaction, it was the reaction of others in the Bureau that this was one of the more astonishing documents
Your
we had ever
cable really
seen.
was the toned-down version.
That was not meant as a
I understand.
humorous remark.
So you were also upset that through meeting or being at the meeting with Singlaub, Ambassador Tams had seemed to associate the United States with this agreement that Singlaub entered into, correct?
Yes, if you look at this, it nowhere says in here, of course, we told him that, this was his own business. You can argue that even if he told Singlaub, this is none of our business, that the sending of the cable is a form of facilitation.
All right, sir. Now, subsequently, as you began to testify before, you met with General Singlaub on April 23 or 24, 1986, and one of the subjects you discussed was this agreement that he had entered into with Pastora, right?
Yes.
And you told him that you weren't really mad at him about the agreement, am I correct?
I didn't think that he had done anything wrong.
Right. Now, would you look at EA Exhibit 2, which is a memo from Richard Melton to you about a meeting that he had with General Singlaub on May 8th. Just for the record, sir, who was Mr. Melton?
Mr. Melton was and is the director of the Office of Central American Affairs in the Bureau of Inter-American Affairs.
Reports to you.
He reports to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central America and me.
All right, sir. Now, in this memo, Exhibit 2, Mr. Melton describes his discussions with General Singlaub about the agreement with Pastora, correct?
Yes.
And says that following the conversations between you and General Singlaub, Singlaub had worked out with Calero and others an agreement to supply Pastora's forces inside Nicaragua with military equipment, including uniforms, boots, and 15,000 rounds of ammunition, correct?
That's what it says.
Now, sir, is that your note in handwriting in the upper right corner of the exhibit?
Yes, it is.
And could you read it?
RM seems to me so little underscored to Pastora that it will keep him on board without screwing blank up. Blank is the chief of the CIA Central America Task Force.
All right, and as you said moments ago, the chief of the task force didn't like Pastora, correct?
Correct.
All right. What was the meaning of that handwritten message that you wrote to Mr. Melton?
Well, trying to piece it together at this juncture, I think I probably told Singlaub that there just wasn't anything we could do for Pastora in the military area. We could promise him, and at a certain point we did promise him, that if he would stay on board that we would try to give him resources out of the $100 million. But there wasn't much we could do, and I guess that Singlaub figured out correctly that the place from which he could get military assistance for Pastora was UNO, which had military goods, and which was not, I think, at this point short of military equipment. And so I guess he told us that what he planned to do was to go talk to Mr. Calero about doing that. And my comment here is really saying, it's generally expressing the view that that's not a bad idea. That, you know, 100 uniforms, 100 pairs of boots won't last very long anyway. You know, keep 100 men in the field for a couple of months. But it was not making Pastora into a huge force such that it would really contravene the overall policy of promoting unity.
All right, so you were in favor of trying to forge this unity between Pastora and...
I wasn't in favor of doing anything. I thought that what Singlab was doing seemed like a good idea.
Well, you see that Mr. Melton also states in his memo, Exhibit 2, that Singlab wants you, meaning you, Secretary Abrams, to try to turn this around.
Well, that is, he wanted me to call Calero and say, if you want my opinion, you should do it.
He wanted you to get involved in trying to help this agreement come to pass. Isn't that right?
That's right. He wanted me to pressure, really what it amounts to, he wanted me to pressure Calero to do it.
And did you speak to Calero about it?
I have no memory of doing that. It's not inconceivable, but I do not recall that I ever did that. I don't think I did.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you subsequently speak to Pastora about this agreement?
Mm-mm. I spoke to Pastora 2 or 3 times in this general period, sort of first half of '86. He on one occasion, he came to see the secretary, or I took him to see the secretary. I would say no. What we talked to Pastora about basically was we were kind of cajoling Pastora. The fear was that he would go back to Nicaragua, and what we were really doing was trying to cajole him into not going back to Nicaragua and to staying with the resistance. We complained to him he needed to clean up his outfit, against which there had been allegations of drug trafficking. He needed to be willing to work with the other elements of the resistance, and if he were doing all of this, then when the great day came and we had the 100 million, why, he could share in it.
All right, so you did try, in some ways, to get Pastora, Calero, and Singlab together on this agreement.
No, I wouldn't say that. I don't remember doing that. I always tried to keep Pastora on board and try to head off what would be the worst possible result, which would be his expressing an allegiance to the Sandinistas going back to Nicaragua.
All right, so would you look at Exhibit 6, which is a memo from Mr. Melton to you dated May 15, 1986. And the first paragraph of that memo again discusses the proposed Singlab, Pastora, Calero agreement and says, General Singlab called again this morning. He asked if there was any additional information I could pass along on the 2 subjects in which he was interested. I told him that we were engaged in a damage-limiting operation with Pastora, with the outcome uncertain. You see that?
Yes.
Now, what was the meaning of a damage-limiting operation with Pastora?
Well, Pastora, our purpose was to keep Pastora. Pastora was constantly attacking UNO. The damage we were trying to limit, I think, was really his constant and repeated attacks on CIA and on UNO and on our whole policy. And the trouble was that we didn't have anything to do, we didn't have anything to give him. We had no resources. We were on the 30th of March, the end of the period of obligation of the $27 million had come, and we were now running down the pipeline and the stocks. The 100 million was nowhere to be seen. All we had for Pastora were promises. We had no resources to give him. What we had to give him were words and promises to try to limit the damage and keep him on board.
All right, so did you not see any problem in associating yourself with this damage-limiting operation and attempt to come up with an agreement among Singlab, Pastora, and Calero?
I'm not sure. I don't believe, as I say, I have no memory of ever engaging in such activity. What I was doing was a different thing, which was doing what I could do, which was to get him to come up to Washington, actually introduce him to the Secretary of State in the hope that these kinds of, if you'll pardon the expression, honors being shown to him would keep him on board.
You didn't think that this was associating the United States government in any way with an agreement that would end up providing military assistance to Pastora?
I don't recall ever talking to Calero about this subject.
Even the conversations with Singlaub and the meetings between Melton and Singlaub about this proposed agreement and assistance, in your view, so that I understand, that did not contain the risk of associating the United States government with an agreement that aimed at furnishing military assistance to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters?
First of all, the resistance in question was not furnishing military assistance to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. It was to have one group of freedom fighters in the possession of military goods give it to another group of freedom fighters who did not have military goods. But the answer is, as best I can recall it, I did not do that. What I did was use what few resources I had, which constituted really the trappings of office.
All right, so one final question on this subject. I believe you testified some moments ago that when you met General Singlaub in April, you told him you were not mad at him and that you didn't think he had done anything wrong, correct?
That's right.
That was your view?
Yeah, I don't think Singlaub was a private citizen. He could do what he wanted.
If that was your view, then why were you so upset about General Singlaub putting down that the agreement was between Pastora and the United States of America?
It would have appeared to me, to Pastora, that Singlaub was representing that was representing the U.S. government, was stating that he was our agent, able to negotiate for the U.S. government, and then the embassy failed to correct that.
And you didn't think that General Singlaub had done anything wrong by making that kind of representation?
Well, he had made a mistake, but he's a private citizen, and when a private citizen makes what I assumed to be an honest mistake of that sort, you say to him, gee, you shouldn't do that. The amazing action was that of the embassy.
All right, sir.
Hearing will stand in recess for 10 minutes.